Hayden. I am the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund, and we are a national organization that's working to stop the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promote a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls happen every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and they cover a wide range of educational topics about trade policy for activists across the country. I do want to note quickly but these calls are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press, I would be more than happy to chat with you separately, but this is not the place for those questions. So I want to recognize the moment that we're all in this week with the change of administration and all the news that's coming out about tariffs and a potential early USMCA negotiation and a flurry of executive orders on trade. I know at times that these things can seem overwhelming, and I hope that today's a space to dive into and really dig down on what the most important pieces of trade organizing are going to look like this year, at least the ones that we know about at this point in time, right? Like we discussed on our November call, Donald Trump's first presidency did see a lot of action on trade, and not necessarily in the ways that voters were always promised. So today we're going to talk about what opportunities are on the horizon for trade advocacy in 2025, of which there are a few notable chances to push for the kind of trade policy that everyone in this room wants to see, one that prioritizes workers, communities, and the planet over corporate profits. To talk through some of these opportunities, we're joined today by Trade Justice's Executive Director, Arthur Stamolis, and the Director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, Julie Bawana. By way of an agenda today, first we're going to hear from Arthur about the upcoming USMCA renegotiation process. Then I'm going to discuss some opportunities on digital trade work that so many of you have put time and energy into over the last 4 years. And then lastly, we're going to hear from Julie Bawana before we take a few minutes to answer questions that folks have. So please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it off to Arthur.
Great. Thanks, Hillary, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. As Hillary mentioned, one of the main things the trade justice movement is going to be focusing on this year is the USMCA review. And Clayton, if you could please start the slides, that would be great. So just really quickly with what is the USMCA? The USMCA is the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement. This was Trump's renegotiated version of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think folks will recall when Trump first ran for the White House, he promised that one of the first things he would do on day one is get the U.S. out of NAFTA. NAFTA is a trade deal that first took effect in 1994. By the time Trump was running for office the first time around, it had already offshored roughly 1 million good-paying American jobs. It continued to not only offshore additional jobs, but also to put a downward pressure on the wages and benefits of the jobs that were left. It expanded corporate power in a bunch of other areas. And at the time, it was serving as the template for other bilateral and multilateral U.S. trade agreements around the world. So people rightly hated NAFTA, and Trump took advantage of that politically. But when he got into power, he didn't exactly keep his promise. Rather than eliminate NAFTA on day one, he instead took a couple of years to renegotiate NAFTA, the main effect of which, in my opinion, was a name change. He renamed it the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement. When all was said and done, the USMCA did have some other substantive differences from NAFTA, some good, some bad. But overall, like on a whole, the majority of the pact was the same as it had been. And if you fast forward to today, the main problems with the original NAFTA deal are some of the main problems we continue to experience under the USMCA. The U.S. trade deficits with Mexico and Canada are both up under the USMCA relative to NAFTA. Good-paying jobs from the U.S. and Canada continue to be sent to Mexico to take advantage of poor labor rights enforcement, low wages, lax pollution controls. We've seen import surges under the USMCA in key industries from automobiles to aerospace to steel to agriculture. And the Mexican people, by the way, have been hurt by NAFTA and the USMCA even worse than Americans and Canadians, something that I'll touch on a bit in a couple of minutes. So in short, the rich continue to get rich under the USMCA, and almost everyone else continues to suffer. Next slide, please. So, actually, if you could, yep, perfect. So now, like one of the good things that was added to the USMCA review relative to the original NAFTA agreement was a review process. There was a requirement in the USMCA that the three countries meet after 6 years to review how the agreement is going. And this mandatory 6-year review is coming up soon. According to the USMCA text, during this review, the three countries can propose first, like any amendments they want to make to the pact, and second, whether or not they want to extend the pact for an additional 16 years. And I want to note, like, failure to extend the pact for 16 years doesn't automatically end the agreement. Instead, what it does is it accelerates the review timeline onto an annual basis. If the countries don't agree to an extension by 2036, then the agreement would be ended. But they have like up to 10 years of additional negotiations before things get to that point. Next slide, please. So here is the USMCA review timeline working backwards. Within the USMCA text itself, the three countries' trade ministers need to meet by July 1st, 2026 to discuss whether they want to amend and or extend the agreement. A month before that meeting, countries have to share any proposed amendments with each other in writing. Then in the U.S. implementing legislation, which is the law that Congress passed to enter the U.S. into the USMCA, there's also a requirement for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to notify Congress a certain number of days before notifying the other countries of its proposals for any amendments and or extension. And working backwards, the absolute deadline for that would be January 4th, 2026. So roughly a year away from now. But again, that's the deadline. That notification could certainly come earlier. Within the U.S. implementing legislation, there's also a requirement for a public comment period. And the deadline for announcing that is October 4th of this year. But again, could come earlier. And then back within the USMCA text itself, the three countries begin their chapter-specific reviews of the labor chapter and the environment chapter a full year before the full agreement review. So that's July 1st of this year, a little over 5 months away from now. And so if you're looking at that final July 2026 deadline, it seems like we've got all the time in the world, right? But if you consider that the Trump administration needs to have its plan in place for the labor and the environment chapters, two of the most important chapters of the entire pact, before it heads into meetings with Canada and Mexico this summer, that really doesn't give us much time to get out there and start influencing their decisions. I'll also point out just this Monday, Inauguration Day, President Trump issued an executive order requiring his new U.S. Trade Representative to get started with with developing a USMCA review game plan. So, this hasn't fallen off his radar whatsoever. And many in the media have suggested that President Trump and the Mexican government and the Canadian government likely want to wrap this up sooner rather than later, if only so that business interests aren't kept in limbo and they have that sort of certainty that they're looking for. Next slide, please. So this is our goal for the USMCA review. We want the USMCA review process to deliver major changes to the pact so that it finally benefits working people, family farmers, and the environment in all three countries. And if the Trump administration can't secure those needed changes, we want it to withdraw from the USMCA altogether, just like Trump promised to do with NAFTA 8 years ago. That's what we want out of this process. And that's what we want to hold President Trump accountable to. Make your trade deal work for working families or get us out of it. As an aside, insofar as we can use this process to also educate people and organizations and policymakers as to what just and sustainable trade policy looks like, and we can get them on the record in support of those policies, that's even better, right? And the USMCA review is a major organizing opportunity for us to start presenting our vision for what trade deals should look like, and we are absolutely going to take advantage of that. Next slide, please. So what do we want in terms of actual USMCA changes? I will say there are a lot of things. Different groups are going to have slightly different lists, but there are some big top lines that people are starting to come around together on. And so first, we want the USMCA renegotiation to end the offshoring of good-paying jobs. As I mentioned, job offshoring continues unabated under the USMCA relative to NAFTA. Companies keep moving work to Mexico to take advantage of the poor labor rights environment, the poor pollution controls, the abysmally low wages. And to counter that, we want the USMCA's labor and environmental terms strengthened. We want its enforcement mechanisms strengthened, and we want more resources put into enforcement. We also want other provisions strengthened so that companies can't easily get around those stronger labor and environmental terms. And we want restrictions on Buy American, Buy Local, other government procurement preference programs removed from both the USMCA and also from the WTO. Next slide, please. So raising wages. There is zero evidence that the USMCA has meaningfully raised wages for workers in the US, Mexico, or Canada. And the renegotiation needs to change that. And in our view, the most straightforward way for the USMCA to raise wages is for the USMCA to require wage increases. So we want actual minimum wages established for key industries before their products can qualify for duty-free access under the pact. And we want to move as quickly as possible to the concept of equal pay for equal work. Workers in Mexico are getting paid pennies on the dollar for doing the exact same work at the exact same quality as workers in the US. And American workers deserve not to have their jobs undermined like that, and Mexican workers deserve not to be exploited like that. And strengthening independent unions through better labor rights enforcement is one way to do that. Flat out requiring wage increases is another way to do that. And these are steps we can take to get to a more just and stable relationship as quickly as possible. And to track our progress on wages, we also want better transparency about wages throughout the supply chain with the mandatory requirements written into the pact. Next slide, please. So Trump promised that the USMCA was going to be the greatest deal ever for American farmers. It has not been. Well, we as consumers are paying record prices at the supermarket. Farmers are still all too often paid less than the cost of production for their crops. This is leading to a ton of consolidation, the death of family farms in the US and in Canada and in Mexico. And we want the USMCA renegotiated to allow countries to create reasonable price floors for family farmers. Countries need to be able to enact policies to manage agricultural supplies and to combat agricultural dumping. And broadly speaking, we just need to be supporting family farmers rather than having policies that support increasingly monopolized giant agribusiness middlemen in all three countries. Another thing on the agricultural side we're pushing for is for the USMCA to establish mandatory country of origin labeling for beef, pork, dairy, eggs, seafood, so that consumers know where their food is coming from. Something that, believe it or not, is currently forbidden by current trade rules. Next slide, please. So as we know, Trump loves to scapegoat and demonize immigrants. He likes to blame Mexico and even Canada for immigration issues. Somehow, for all his criticism of NAFTA, he continues to ignore the role that NAFTA played in driving immigration by dumping US corn, wheat, soy on Mexico below the cost of production, something that forced literally millions of small-scale Mexican farmers off their land. And also, NAFTA also played a huge role in displacing tens of thousands of small and medium-sized employers in Mexico, with companies like Walmart coming in. Of course, the USMCA has done nothing to correct these issues. And so rather than malign immigrants, we want the USMCA renegotiation to address these root causes of migration and also to better protect the rights of migrant laborers in all three countries. Next slide, please. So, I could go on and on with things we want, but I'll just sort of wrap up the what we want section by saying we also need the USMCA renegotiation to get rid of other corporate giveaways. Some of these giveaways are things that were written into the original NAFTA and weren't adequately addressed during the last renegotiation. Other corporate giveaways actually weren't in NAFTA and were introduced by the Trump administration to the USMCA. So in that first category, we need to finish the job of eliminating ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, which we've talked about here many times before. ISDS was significantly scaled back in the USMCA, but it wasn't killed entirely. So let's do that now. Jumping ahead in bullets, also in the category of NAFTA holdovers, we need to eliminate pharmaceutical monopoly protections that drive up the cost of medicines. And then in terms of like new USMCA provisions that stink and we need to get rid of, we need to get rid of the digital trade rules that Trump added to NAFTA for big tech, which Hillary is going to discuss further. So like these are the changes that the USMCA needs to make if it's going to have any benefit for workers, family farmers, and the environment. And again, if the master negotiations of the Trump administration can't secure these minimal changes, not only should they absolutely refuse to extend the pact for another 16 years beyond its current 2036 end date, but they should withdraw the US from the USMCA altogether. Now, I'll say like USMCA withdrawal isn't a cure-all, in part because of the damage already wrought under decades of USMCA and NAFTA, and in part because other trade deals are in place, like through the WTO. And so the ideal is to actually replace the USMCA with a renegotiated pact that benefits workers, farmers, the planet. But if we can't get that, no deal is better than the existing bad deal. And last slide, please. So as I mentioned, like this is an issue we're going to be talking about a lot this year, potentially even into 2026. We're going to do briefings that do a much deeper dive on a lot of these individual policy areas. And we're going to focus a lot more on what you can do in your community to make a difference during the USMCA review. Over the coming months, expect to hear us ask you to help out in a bunch of different ways. Organizationally, we're going to need your groups to sign on to cross-sector letters about the USMCA review. Individually, there are going to be opportunities to sign petitions to trade negotiators, and later in the year to submit official public comments. We're also going to need your help getting your members of Congress to take strong positions during the USMCA review. And throughout all this, we're also going to need your help spreading the word from the bottom up about what a successful USMCA renegotiation needs to accomplish, which means, handing out materials, giving people updates at meetings and events, sharing social media posts, inviting friends and colleagues to briefings like this one. I can tell you that right now, we're continuing to do due diligence on some of the first of these organizing vehicles, like the sign-on letters and whatnot, checking in with key partner organizations nationally and internationally, and also with our key congressional champions. But we expect to have some of these tools in your hands by your February Power Hour, if not sooner. So please keep an eye out. Like you are the people on the front lines of building knowledge, building excitement, building momentum around trade justice campaigns. And we're very much going to need your leadership to get that done during this one. And to that end, let me just close by saying that I know many of you are veterans of the last NAFTA renegotiation, of the TRIPS waiver campaign, of the TPP campaign, other trade fights. We also need your ideas on how we can work together to make a difference on this issue, holding Trump accountable to his promises on trade and delivering the concrete changes that our communities need and deserve. So over the coming weeks, the coming months, please let us know what you're doing on the USMCA and how we can help, because this is definitely going to be a two-way street. Thanks. Let me turn it back to you, Hillary.
Thanks so much, Arthur. I'm really excited about the USMCA review process, and like Arthur said, I know there's lots of folks in this room that have roots in trade advocacy that reach back, a long ways. Even some of you to the original NAFTA, and this is going to be such an important moment for us to push again for better rules. I want to encourage folks again to put questions in the Q&A, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. Next, I want to turn to a conversation around digital trade. Digital trade is going to be another big focus for the trade justice movement this year, both inside the context of that USMCA renegotiation and outside of it. As a lot of you already know, one of the biggest new fronts in the trade debate in recent years has been attempts by big tech to use trade agreements as a backdoor mechanism to head off regulations for online privacy, for data security, for AI accountability, for anti-monopoly work, and more. Just like Big Pharma was able to rig trade deals in the 80s and 90s with rules that undermined access to medicine, rules that we're still living with today. And just like big ag and chemical companies were able to use trade deals to put limits on food safety standards, big tech is trying today to sneak rules into trade agreements that restrict regulation of their sector. So these rules really came to a head during the first Trump administration, when Trump's trade negotiators initially snuck rules for big tech into an executive level trade deal with Japan that fortunately doesn't have a ton of enforcement teeth behind it. But then when the USMCA negotiations came around, added a more meaningful substantive digital trade chapter that has some enforcement, right? When President Biden came into office, his administration initially tried to expand those Trump-era digital trade rules into more trade agreements. But after a lot of hard work and campaigning by folks in this room, we were able to educate the Biden administration on this issue and make them see how digital trade rules are really in conflict with what they in Congress were attempting to do on privacy and AI oversight. And after a lot of organizing, folks here will remember early morning and late night Kenya STIP and IPUF listening sessions. You'll remember relentless work on organizational sign-on letters, congressional sign-on letters. The Biden administration decided to officially reverse course on the U.S. position on digital trade, withdrawing that U.S. support for big tech giveaways at the WTO and in other trade negotiations. So now I want to jump forward to today. We don't really know, right, exactly what the Trump administration is going to do. Obviously, the first Trump administration is the one that saddled us with these digital trade rules in the first place. And not only that, but even a passing glance, right, at the inauguration reveals how cozy Trump seems with tech bros in 2025. So I will say that I think we are likely to have our work cut out for us on this issue. But the other thing that I really want to say in this space is that there's so much more organizing around this issue than there ever was during the first Trump administration. I'll share anecdotally that in my former role at the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, where Julie is now, we led one of the first state-based education programs around digital trade at a time when no one was talking about digital trade rules. So as an organizer, to watch our movement go from that moment where nobody knew what it was to reversing the U.S. position on digital trade in a matter of 6 or 7 years feels really incredible. The USMCA review is really the perfect place for us to get started on this work. If we can actually get the Trump administration to support removing giveaways to big tech there, that's suddenly 2 administrations, right? A Democratic one and a Republican one, who will have said that they don't support those trade giveaways to big tech, and that they're not going to let trade deals handcuff governments when it comes to privacy and data security and AI oversight and anti-monopoly work. That would mean not just a Biden administration withdrawal of U.S. support for digital trade rules, but really a new U.S. position saying no to digital trade rules altogether, which would be really good for the U.S. and really good for our trading partners. So no matter what happens, we're going to be pushing hard to make a removal of the USMCA's digital trade provisions a big priority in that campaign. The other thing to say is that what other grounds the digital trade debate plays out in over the course of the coming years remains to be seen. For example, will the Trump administration try to jumpstart digital trade giveaways of the WTO again? Will they try to add additional digital rules to other bilateral agreements? I don't have good answers to those questions today, but time will tell. One area that we're paying special attention to right now is a potential trade deal with Kenya. The first Trump administration tried to strike a trade deal with Kenya, but never quite got that deal across the finish line. Kenya is a country that is specifically marketing itself as a potential low-cost location for data farms, for all the related digital economy employment involved with training AI, monitoring social media sites, and all of that. something that will actually be the topic of next month's Power Hour briefing, which I'm going to talk about briefly in a minute. One of the main reasons that companies are pushing for binding rules and trade agreements that allow them to ship people's personal data around the globe without regard to privacy standards or data security standards is specifically because they want to move that data to low-wage countries where labor rights are not respected so that they can pay digital economy workers there pennies on the dollar. So next month, we're going to hear from some of those workers in Kenya about their working conditions and what they're doing to fight back. And my big ask for you in this regard today is just to please pencil that briefing into your calendar right now. It's going to be February 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's going to feature some of our partners from Tech Equity Collaborative that have been doing really great work with folks in Kenya and elsewhere. It will likely feature video comments from some of the international folks. I would really love for them to join in person, but time zones are the bane of my existence and number one enemy in these moments. But when you get a formal event notice from us next month, please take a moment not only to RSVP for yourself, but also think to yourself, who else in my friends network and in my colleagues network would be interested in learning about this issue? I think that folks really have a tendency to see digital trade as an issue that has kind of a black box around it, and has a big learning curve to understanding data and algorithms. And I think the main idea that we really want to drive home in next month's Power Hour is organized around like many other pieces of trade work, the fight to stop bad digital trade rules is really about solidarity with workers across borders. We cannot let Trump bring us back to rigging trade deals in the interest of big tech to the detriment of workers in the United States and Kenya and elsewhere. So please, again, sign up for that call when you see it. Please pencil it into your calendar for February 20 at 3 p.m. Eastern. And please think about who else in your network might benefit from being on that call. And then lastly, if you have questions about digital trade, put those in the Q&A so we can answer them in a few minutes. So with that, I'm excited to organize on digital trade with you all again this year. I know there's a bunch of work that folks in this room have done, and we've really made a difference in the past. And I think, there's a lot of opportunities to continue that work this year. But right now, I want to pass the mic off to Julie to share about a fun opportunity to weigh in on the impacts of U.S. trade policy on race, gender, and disability rights that's happening this spring. Julie? Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Like Hillary said, my name is Julie. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm with the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, which is a coalition of over 70 labor, environmental, farmer, and other social justice organizations advocating for a fair and sustainable global trading system. And what I'm going to talk about today is, one of our main campaigns this year. And like Hillary said, something that you can get involved in today. And it revolves around the disparate impacts of trade, or basically, how trade policy impacts different communities differently. And, it's common knowledge for the most part at this point, and definitely in this room here, that free trade has done no good for anyone except, billionaire CEOs and the top 1%, and that everyone else has had to bear the burden of trade policy while the elite benefit. But the important part here is that not everyone bears that same burden. And I think, at the heart of every social justice movement, and definitely the trade justice movement, is the understanding that systems and structures, for example, the global economic system, exacerbate existing inequalities and disparities. So we talked about NAFTA, right? You take NAFTA 1.0, this has had a devastating impact on every regular, everyday person who isn't a billionaire in the entirety of North America and beyond. But that impact deepens when you look at the way it has impacted, a worker in a rural community whose factory shut down, or a largely female workforce in a garment factory who were laid off and could no longer support their families or their communities. Or if you look at older Americans and Americans with disabilities whose prescription drug prices rocketed due to intellectual property rights. So these are the types of disparities that we not only have to acknowledge, but that we really have to make central in our work to have a successful trade justice movement. we have to bring these communities in and let them be the ones that guide our work because they're the most impacted by the work that we do. So there's a really great and timely opportunity to do that right now. And for you to get involved, right? I'm sure many or all of you on this call are part of a community that has been disproportionately impacted by trade. Currently, the U.S. International Trade Commission, which is an independent government body, is hosting a series of virtual and in-person roundtables on this very topic. Let me share my screen. So, um, they're hosting a series of conversations on this very topic, on the impacts of, they're calling it the distributional impacts of trade. So, how trade impacts different communities differently. The virtual ones, which have been happening so far, have been kind of broken up by different like subsection or community. So we had one on gender and gender identity, on skill, wage, and income, gender and gender identity, and so on. These roundtables are really important because they're not just a space for lobbyists or industry insiders, as are like most trade spaces, most listening sessions. And instead, these are really conversations where community members like you and me can directly share our experiences and shape the policies that impact our lives. The roundtables will basically culminate in a report which will be released in 2026 that will be publicly available. So our voices will literally be on the public record on trade policy. So these sessions are open to the public. So, I've attended the first two, and just in terms of a report back, they've been a breath of fresh air in terms of being like no other listening session packed with corporate lobbyists. These have truly been like roundtables where folks who've registered to speak in advance are having a conversation about how trade impacts the communities they represent. So, at the gender and gender identity roundtable, we heard from women's organizations as well as LGBTQIA plus groups about how trade impacts those communities. And then the most recent roundtable just happened yesterday on skill, wage, and income, and that gave space for labor partners to talk about how their members are impacted. So again, really great and wonderful opportunities to engage with policymakers on what you or your community needs from trade policy. I encourage, if anyone in this space has been part of any of those conversations, to let us know what you thought in the chat. In terms of action items, you can still participate in the upcoming roundtables. The upcoming ones are all virtual, easy to access. Registration is open. And again, these are specifically for community members to share their and their community's experiences living the trade impacts. You don't have to be a trade expert to feel the impacts of trade and to contribute to these conversations. So there should be a link coming in the chat where you can let us know the sessions that you'd be interested in participating in, and we'll reach out to you with more information about how to register, talking points if you need any. But yeah, I really encourage you to get involved and share your experiences, help shape future trade policy. If there are any of these topics that resonate with you or your community, definitely let us know in that form. It is important to note that the registration deadline is a full week before the session. So if you are interested, make sure to let us know as soon as possible, so we have time to reach out to you. And then, in addition to these virtual roundtables, there are going to be in-person hearings. We don't have a whole lot of information about those yet, but you can see more about those on the slide here. They'll be basically throughout the spring from March to May. They'll be going to Tulsa, El Paso, If you are local to any of those places or have connections there, especially Seattle and El Paso, where we have organizers working on this, but really any of these places, please also let us know through that form that you're interested. Again, this is a really rare opportunity for us to get our voices on the record, and I really encourage you to join us in advocating for the changes that we want to see in trade policy. So as these discussions continue, let's make sure that our voices are part of the story, and the more that we can amplify our voices, our community's voices, the more we can influence the policies that impact our lives. So thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to ask Arthur and Julie to come off or put their cameras on now for a few Q&A questions. We have several of them here in the little platform. I do want to remind folks to go ahead and click Q&A and type your question in there if you have questions for Julie, for me, or for Arthur. I want to start with a question that I think is actually an excellent question that I expect we're going to be getting quite a lot of, Arthur. Will Congress have the chance to vote on this USMCA renegotiation, or is that not going to be part of this iteration?
Yeah, so in my view, Congress is going to have to demand a vote over the USMCA. The people may recall the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the right to set the terms of U.S. trade policy, and the White House the role of negotiating with other countries. So, within the Constitution, I think the question is clear. How that's played out in the past has often been the executive branch trying to claim as much power as they can. I think certainly if the USMCA renegotiation changes tariff lines or requires immediate changes to US law, which if it's a substantive renegotiation, it absolutely will have to, then Congress would have a role. The issue is if the Trump administration tries to make minor adjustments, changes to things that Canada and Mexico have to do, but not so much changes to things the United States have to do, or something that handcuffs future US policy, but doesn't require an immediate change to US law, or if they decide just to extend the pact, but not make changes. Those are situations where I would suspect they will try to get away without a congressional vote, and where Congress will need to demand a vote. If folks remember back to the first NAFTA renegotiation that gave us the USMCA, it was only because we had that leverage of Congress's vote where we were able to get a lot of the bad language that the Trump administration had proposed removed, like certain extensions of monopoly protections for pharmaceutical companies, which would have been really, really damaging. And it was only because of that leverage that we were able to get, some of the positive measures added, like the rapid response, facility-specific labor enforcement tools. Now, the Trump administration never used those tools to enforce labor rights, but the Biden administration actually did on dozens of occasions, and tens of thousands of Mexican workers now have, the independent unions of their choosing. Many of them have better contracts because of that. If Congress doesn't have any say whatsoever and Trump can just do whatever he wants, I think that puts us in a much, much, much weaker position to get anything close to the changes we need. So hopefully that answers people's questions. The short answer is Congress is going to need to force it, and we might need to, persuade Congress to do so.
That's super helpful. A lot of questions about USMCA here. So one question that I think is also interesting, Arthur, I don't know if you'll have a good answer to this, but I'm also curious. What do you think that we can expect from Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, in the USMCA negotiation and on workers' rights generally? And kind of a follow-up question, are there good ways that you can already see kind of forming on how to support an independent union movement in Mexico throughout the negotiations?
Yeah, and I'll say like I'm not an expert. I think some of the people, in the audience today probably have better answers to that question than I do. I will say, right, she comes out of AMLO's camp in Mexico, which has been, much stronger on labor rights and raises for workers than certainly past Mexican administrations. I'm terrible with statistics, but my recollection is that, real wages for Mexican workers did not increase at all, like, under the first 20 some years of NAFTA. It was only when AMLO came in and actually raised the minimum wage did wages go up slightly. Um, and so, I think she is about as good of a partner as we could sort of hope for in terms of like, who's in power these days. But I also think civil society groups are going to need to push her from the Mexican side. Like there are certainly business interests who are going to want that certainty of just getting a quick deal. And Trump is certainly, as he already is going to be bullying Mexico to do things that we as progressives, are unlikely to want, like border militarization and other BS. And so I think, she's going to find herself in a position where she will benefit by civil society groups making demands in Mexico and in the US and in Canada. And if others have views on that, I would love to hear them.
Awesome. Um, Another question on USMCA. If the USMCA would change to allow for better farm policies related to farm prices, et cetera, how likely would Congress be to make those changes? I don't see a lot of support for these kinds of changes in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a very sort of real politic question, and I appreciate it. I would say there hasn't been a lot of support for any of the progressive things that we've advocated for in Congress initially, over 30 some years of doing trade work. It requires a lot of movement building to get elected officials to buck corporate interest and do the right things for their constituents. But it's not impossible. And a lot of folks in rural communities are as pissed as folks in the big manufacturing cities and the smaller manufacturing towns about the way that trade deals have privileged elites and big corporations over themselves. And so I think there are opportunities here where there haven't been opportunities in past years. But I think the implication behind the question is absolutely right. Like it's going to require a lot of organizing to get there.
I see I should incorporate a comment about this into my intro because I get asked every single month. But yes, I will send out a link to this call and a recording of this call in a follow-up email this afternoon or tomorrow morning, depending on how long it takes us to process it on my Wi-Fi. So be on the lookout for that, and please feel free to share the recording with folks. Appreciate that question. This is a little bit of a technical question, I think tied to the rapid response mechanism. But what proposed amendment would address the weakness of site-specific enforcement that failed to take action against the VU manufacturing in Piedras Negras when it closed the plant to avoid negotiating a contract with the union? And is there a way that we could create an enforcement tool that could truly hold companies accountable for those kinds of actions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that specific case. I will say that there is a lot of interest in creating stronger standards around the blacklisting issue that's come up in some of the cases. There's a lot of interest in creating greater transparency in the system, like requiring the publication of complaints and certain things. I'm not necessarily outing workers who complain, but the people who are reviewing these cases, sort of putting their paperwork out there for review. And there's also interest in creating new requirements that that governments have to consult with the affected workers and their chosen representatives before announcing negotiated settlements, which is something that we think would clear up not all the problems, but at least some of the problems with the system. So those are some of the things that people are talking about. And then, of course, there's discussions about enumerating, a wider number of labor rights, a wider number of environmental agreements that should be enforced, creating new enforcement mechanisms specifically on the labor issue, and really just sort of tightening up the system. And as I mentioned earlier, making sure that there's a lot more funding to use it. The cases where has been used, not all of them have had great outcomes, but a lot of them have had very, very positive outcomes. And there are a ton of cases where this system could be used where it just isn't being used. We need more resources to make sure that happens.
One thing I want to jump in and remind folks about in regard to the rapid response mechanism is that prior to that mechanism being in existence at all, sometimes it would take like years and years and years and years for there to even become like some kind of final ruling or final result to any of these cases. And so this is like a big improvement that we can use it and that there have been these outcomes, but there's still like, as Carl is noting in his question, there's some room for improvement yet too. Another question, speaking as an Ohio voter where we lost our great friend, Senator Sherrod Brown in this last election, do you have a count or an idea of the number of fair trade supporters that there are in Congress? Are there people that you see as unknowns? Is there any intel that you want to share in this space about that?
Yeah, I would say there are still a lot of fair trade champions in Congress. I was at the House Trade Working Group meeting last week. The room was like standing room only. I mean, it was packed to the gills. People were pouring out into the hallways. There's a lot of interest from Congress in this issue. On the C4 side, not through trade justice. A lot of organizations are going in and having those meetings with freshman members of Congress now to get them up to speed on these issues, to make sure that they're in the right place. Yeah, I've got some information about trade in the elections I can share, but that's probably for a different call than this one.
That's helpful. Thanks, Arthur. I'm doing one last check in the Q&A to be sure that we got to everyone's questions. I think that we did. Okay. Awesome. I think we got to everybody's questions. I'm double checking the chat too, because I know sometimes people stick them there. Cool. Okay. So I think we are going to leave Q&A there. I want to give a big thank you to Arthur and Julie for sharing today about some of these big opportunities that we have in 2025. We're really looking forward to working with all of you toward or holding on to our previous wins and toward building ground for true trade justice in 2025. As I mentioned a little bit ago, I'm going to be in touch with a recording of this call and a follow-up email. I really look forward to seeing folks in February for our Digital Trade Power Hour. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone. See you in February.